Thanks for joining us, Padraig. Nice to have you on The Humble Pie, our second episode. So I'm very excited about talking to you today and all of the pretty cool and very topical, relevant things that we'll get into, specifically around privacy, data rights, and how organizations can be better safeguarding all of these important concepts, certainly for the in the near future. So yeah, appreciate you spending some time today with me.
Yeah, awesome, Alex. Very excited to be on. I really enjoyed the first episode. So.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, yeah. It might have been a little rough on my side, but hopefully get better and better as we go. But I'm also very excited about this being the first podcast with a fellow Valencian. So that's good. But I suppose with a remote format, it can always just be anywhere in the world. So how long have you been in Valencia now?
So I've been in Valencia 3 years.
Okay.
Yeah. So time does fly, but we love it here. Particularly, I appreciate having the sun during lockdown, has kind of redoubled my appreciation for life in Valencia.
Yeah, it helps, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so you're the founder of QueryLayer. Maybe just before you kind of define what QueryLayer does and what you guys are busy with at the moment. Your background has kind of been in computer science. You have a doctorate in computer science. You founded 2 other companies. What's kind of led you to this point of what you do at QueryLayer? What's kind of guided your interests in your career up until right now?
Yeah, so definitely, passionate about technology and particularly software, and been working in, I suppose, data-driven applications for about 10 years. I suppose the interest in privacy started whilst working on a healthcare project in Dublin back around 2011. So I was head of data at the Centre for Connected Health, and we were building a dementia deployment to support patients with early onset dementia. And during that project, I suppose the patients or the initial participants were quite nervous, or naturally so, about with whom we were sharing this data about their condition. And I suppose seeing that nervousness at first hand really gave me an appreciation for privacy and how, data means different things for different people. And while you might be flippant about certain aspects of your data, when you see someone and in that situation, really worried about a particular condition, very worried about who might know about this condition, that you get appreciation why privacy can be a really big deal for people.
Amazing, yeah, and certainly a space that you can. It's palpable to feel the importance of people and their privacy and their data in the medical space, and so many others as well, which is, I suppose, led you to found something like QueryLayer. So maybe just in a nutshell, what is the sort of the vision for QueryLayer, and what are you trying to accomplish in this space?
Yeah, so I suppose the underlying thesis of it is that we believe that data privacy is a right, and we think customers do too. And so that's we approach enterprises and I suppose help them offer data rights to their users. And so we do that by providing data rights infrastructure to these companies. And the majority of companies actually want to do the right thing by their users and their customers. They want to offer them data rights and control and transparency around how they're handling their data. But it's just an extremely difficult thing to do for a variety of different reasons. And so we want to, one company at a time, help individuals get control back over their data.
Okay, so when you speak about privacy or data rights at the user level, the individual level, what just for us to work with the definition, what exactly do you mean? What does that entail? What exactly needs to be secured?
Yeah, so by data rights or personal data rights, what we're saying is that the right of an individual to have control over their personal data and to have an understanding of how their personal data is being used in any situation or company. And personal data rights so is not just something that's enshrined in law and I think everyone is well aware of GDPR, and it's every day an effect of how we use the internet or how most of us work. But it's also like an ethical consideration. So 10 years ago, the mindset was that whoever processed the data owned the data. And so, we could see that in, early social media companies because they collected that information or because they requested that information from an individual and therefore processed it, they felt that they owned that data and it was there to do as they wanted. And that mindset has changed. In the last 3 years, it's been amazing, the transformation that has happened in how people consider their personal data. And now, personal data rights is basically it's the realization or the awareness that the owner, the individual, they own that data. They should have full control over that data. They should have transparency about how that data is being used. And the company is just borrowing that information to serve a particular purpose.
So I love what you said about making the distinction between somebody or an entity that owns the data versus the entity that is maybe just borrowing it or is lent the data for the time being. And that can easily be confused by a company or an entity that has interests in controlling that data, right? For example, Facebook or so on, they've obviously got a commercial interest in thinking that they do own the data. But of course, there's been, as you've said, the last few years, certain things have caught up. Perhaps the legal framework, perhaps other ethical considerations have now caught up with them where they've got to change their game, change the way they talk about it and so on. So just on that then, is it always a case of sort of having the legal framework or the ethical considerations that you've spoken about always having to kind of play catch up to where things are and then to sort of either legislate that or provide a more of a concrete framework to manage that? Is there no way to kind of be a bit more preemptive, to be ahead of where things are going? Or is that just the way that progress works?
Yeah, so I think market forces via customer pressure, that'll be the main driver in this space in the next few years. So far it's being driven by regulatory changes, largely. But what we're starting to see is this growth of privacy actives. And these are a subsection of your customers who make choices around the brands, the products that they use based on how they perceive that company handles their personal data, how they respect their personal data. And so these privacy actives, I think that they'll be a major driver for increasing data rights, personal data rights in the next few years. And actually what's most interesting about this customer segment, these privacy actives, is that what we're seeing is that largely they are late 20s, early 30s, let's say early career professionals with large disposable incomes. So for particular types of companies and brands, let's say e-commerce or lifestyle, then these could be a large percentage of your profit. And therefore it makes commercial sense to, change your data handling practices, not just because of a compliance, motivation,
being on
but
the
also
right side of change.
Exactly, yeah. And this is powerful. I think this is far more powerful than any regulatory change or regulatory pressure that companies face.
So when it comes down to users, whether they're everyday individuals, whether they're the users of a particular system or framework within organizations, whatever the case may be, when you mention that there's a need to take control of their privacy, their information, that makes sense. But how does one go about taking control if you're operating at the user level?
Yeah. So, and this is probably one of the hardest parts of this. I think it's the theoretical argument is in some ways it's kind of easy to justify, or it's simpler to come to the conclusion that users should have control. But the practical aspects of this is where it gets complicated, because data is complicated. So in terms of giving user control, that control needs to be simple. It needs to be understandable. It needs to be in the context in which they're making this. So let's say, rather than just upfront, blasting them with permissions or choices around their data, you place those controls in the time and moment in which they're making a decision around their data. And I suppose there's lots of different strategies or approaches you can take to give meaningful control to the user, whether in a product experience or a service experience. But that is really, that's where it gets challenging, I think.
The actual practical components of not only driving that change, but then enforcing and educating, I suppose, users on how and what to do with their data. Because ultimately,
and because this it's a very complicated area. It's complicated for companies. It's complicated for, let's say, data engineers and security officers and data protection officers. So for members of the public who, might have no background in data or just they're, general users of a service, then there's a big communication gap between how we talk about data protection within the enterprise and in a regulatory level to how we need to talk about it on an individual level. And, that's why a lot of the existing controls that we use or the existing controls that we offer individuals over their personal data are broken right now. So if you think about an individual who is using the internet today, any service, then the primary means by which they control their personal data is through privacy policies and consent pop-ups. And privacy policies are notoriously difficult to read. I think almost nobody does,
intentionally,
and that's because they're not. And it's because they're serving a different purpose. They're serving the purpose of the business. They're protecting the business. Their function is not to educate and to inform the individual. And therefore, someone making a decision around their personal data based on a privacy policy, it's really, I suppose it's a failed control. And similarly with consent, in most cases, consent is it's illusionary. And we see that in the recent WhatsApp example, where WhatsApp updated their terms and conditions and their privacy policy. And, I'm sure most people got the consent pop-up, which basically said consent or delete, consent or get off our platform. And that doesn't feel like consent. That feels like, gun to the head.
And it doesn't feel like a choice.
No, certainly not. Yeah. And that's why these controls, in some ways, you could almost consider them as failed controls from an individual perspective.
And the WhatsApp one is a great example because it's such a massive, ubiquitous system anyway. I mean, who doesn't use WhatsApp? And there may be some alternatives now, or perhaps have been around for a while, but still, you can't argue with the fact that they have the lion's share of the messaging market. And so what I suppose I'm asking, if you have a recommendation or advice or something where you could almost advise somebody on how to, not what decision they should make when it comes to consent or delete, but how to think about that kind of choice. Because it doesn't feel like a choice. Are you either going to just stop using WhatsApp, or are you just going to be party to whatever new update in their regulation that they have, and just kind of swim along with it? Or is there a kind of a new way to think about how to handle that? Because it seems that these organizations that just amass more and more of our information, of data, they can almost do whatever they want, right? So how can a user or an agent in the system make use of that, or rather make a sound decision? What's the best way to think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And, it's something that I've struggled with personally. So from a principal point of view, I don't want to use WhatsApp, something like Signal. And I've tried to migrate from WhatsApp. But, for instance, my mother in Ireland, she uses WhatsApp, and I could barely get her using on WhatsApp in the first place. So trying to convince her to move over to Signal because Facebook was collecting her data, or just perception that it was, which, just as an argument, is not going to fly. So, I can only speak personally, but I would consider myself as a kind of an objecting WhatsApp user, and I haven't consented to the new privacy policy. I think there's a deadline of April or May, if I'm not wrong. But and I probably I will end up accepting it because it's just the social pressure to accept it. But yeah, I think that is difficult. There is the concept of data minimization, and that's something that I try to do. So I do have a Facebook login, but I've no photos and no kind of data, so to speak, on Facebook. And that's how I suppose balance social pressure versus my, I suppose, disdain for that sense that I have that these services are kind of forcing me into taking actions that I don't want to take or I'm uncomfortable with.
Yeah, which seems to be sort of magnified, day to day now. Like you said, 10 years ago or whatever, nobody thought about this, or maybe some people were thinking about it, and maybe some were, prescient enough to kind of understand, well, maybe this will have ramifications later on. But, we were happy to install apps and, upload photos and, give away our location information and so on, until one day, actually not happy about that. So in a sense, everyday users are also complicit in creating the monster, perhaps not knowingly, of course, but then it's difficult to kind of strip away, how much consent or how much control do you really have, because we've been feeding the monster. Do you think that, just kind of tying it back into an enterprise sort of environment, which is where query layer works, do you feel that that's a different environment, that there's another way of looking at it when it comes to how organizations can be more responsible with their end user privacy rights and data?
Yeah, for sure. I sometimes think that, like senior executives in a lot of these companies are being given maybe they've been told a narrative around this that is quite negative. And that narrative is around GDPR fines, 4% of annual revenue, kind of push compliance solutions pushed on them that are like these big, heavy enterprise solutions. And then, talk about manual processes and checking boxes.
They feel like burdens.
Yeah. And it's a very negative, it's all about, it's about cost saving, and it's negative, and it's about, fine mitigation or risk mitigation. I think what I would like to see is that conversation change to the opportunity that this presents, so that privacy isn't something negative from an enterprise point of view. It's not something to be scared of, but something to be embraced as a differentiator within your market. And we already see that with examples like let's say if we look at the big tech firms, Apple in the last 12 or 24 months, a big part of their narrative now, even in video ads and TV ads that they've placed online, is around this privacy as a differentiator. We're different because we actually respect your data. And so I think this is the opportunity within the enterprise space, is to change the narrative, and change. It's an element of changing the relationship that you have with your customers.
I mean, I'm just trying to think about what John, the previous guy I had on, who was he was sort of almost a little bit more pessimistic about this kind of thing, where a lot of brands, especially to the scale of Apple, would probably just he'd see this as just another PR stunt of trying to get on the right side of the conversation right now, but then perhaps in the background still it's business as usual. So how to what degree may that be going on, firstly, but then B, how can we hold them to account and make sure that they are doing what they're saying, and they are really looking at privacy as a differentiator and not just paying lip service?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think any, let's say, positioning that Apple does from a privacy perspective, or any standpoint that they're making that I don't doubt that they're making it from a commercial point of view. And so there's undoubtedly a huge number of factors around control, platform control, when you think of like the App Store, that go into the making of that decision. Yeah, I mean, for sure. And the second part of your question, Alex?
Yeah, just about kind of making sure that there's some kind of power that the user or even the consumer might have in the equation that can still hold, a company like Apple and so on to account if things don't change, or that there's sufficient incentive to change or to make things a little bit more kind of privacy centric.
Yeah, so I mean, I think going back to the WhatsApp example, that's an example of, I suppose, a consumer power, or consumers holding a large enterprise to account over a decision that they're making around personal data usage. So, irregardless of WhatsApp push those changes through, that negative press has an effect on their bottom line, and we saw that with the Facebook scandals in the last few years, where the stock price was affected by decisions that they were making. So, at the end of the day, these are profit-driven organizations, and until and decisions that they're making will ultimately be affected by the bottom line. I think Apple are aware that a strong privacy posture is going to have a strong impact on their bottom line, and therefore, yeah, they're getting ahead of the game. And I suppose, and that's why when we speak to enterprises, we're not just saying, this is the right thing to do from a regulatory perspective or from an ethical perspective, but this is actually the smart thing to do. And therefore, you could take a short-term perspective on this and just try check the boxes from a compliance perspective. But while you're doing this, why not do it right? Get out in front of it, and actually showcase to the world why you're different.
Yeah. Getting on the right side of change.
Yeah, and what I often find interesting is, if when you think of, let's say, the website of any major brand or company, I think how optimized that website is. Every element of that website is optimized around conversion. We're like 20 years of sign in buttons or log in or subscribe buttons, and every color, format, positioning on the page has been tried and tested, right? All around this, trying to get minute areas of, like performance improvements. And then you see all of them have this, privacy policy piece, that's right there on the front page. You click into it and then bam, you're just hit with a wall of text, and I'm convinced that there's a missing opportunity within that like dump of text, that there's a better way, there's a smarter way. And that's why I think marketing groups and marketing departments, they should be looking at this privacy space and seeing, there's probably a conversion opportunity here. There's an optimization opportunity here that we could be missing.
And just on that, because it's a very interesting point. Something that you mentioned before we started recording was, the concept of the state of privacy policy and how it's carried out, how it's communicated. It has a user experience problem. And this is probably what you're alluding to now, the fact that it's just this sort of nondescript dump of text that, nobody engages with, or at least wants to. And you're absolutely right. Everybody knows what it's like. You just kind of like, oh God, I can't scroll through this faster, in order to get to the bottom, just to, all right, fine. I just want to buy this watch. I just want to log in here. I just want to do that. So how are there any strategies or perhaps some ideas that you're working through QueryLay at the moment that there's some ideas on how to make that a little bit more of an inviting, almost sort of collaborative experience of understanding what the privacy policy entails, what it means for the customer, and ultimately empower both the enterprise and the user?
Yeah, so it's not hard to imagine how these privacy policies could be even slightly improved. It wouldn't take an expert in UI UX to figure out that this isn't a good user experience, right?
Yeah.
So the obvious question is, well, then why? Why are they like this? And the majority of the reasons that they're structured in this way is, one, because they're written by legal departments, and secondly, at the very bottom of every privacy policy, you have take control of your data, or you have this option where you can exercise your data rights. But because the underlying infrastructure isn't there to actually handle these requests, then companies, they actually don't want to highlight this as an option. And so a lot of companies that we speak to, they're like, oh yeah, I'm totally into this. Yeah, I definitely think it's the right thing to do. But, it just takes me so long to work through one of these requests that then I don't want them to come in. So therefore, I don't want to make it a good experience, or I don't want the user to take that action at the end.
Just keep that door closed. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's that way, like, fax us in a request, or telegrams only, And the reason for that is that the companies, they're not in a place where they can handle these type of requests. And then what we're seeing on the other side is these type of requests, whether you are getting them right now or not, there's a definite trend that these requests are on the up, and it's going to be only increasingly so as more and more customers expect these data rights, and then are going to demand it from the companies. So back to your question, there are some very simple strategies to make this experience easier, but you first need to understand, or you need to ask why the company hasn't taken these steps already. And in the majority of cases, it's because the capability to handle these requests isn't within the organization, or it isn't within their stack. And actually what you see is when one of these requests comes in, we see it time and time again, it kicks off like this kind of pandemonium within the company, where you have one poor soul who's responsible for running around the organization, shoulder tapping all the different application owners and responsible people, and then chasing them mercilessly for the next 30 days in order to get the data for that individual out of them, and then try to put it all together and then get it back to the individual. Yeah, they hate it. It must be one of the, least enjoyable jobs in any company, and that's definitely what we're being told as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it almost feels like it's ripe for a complete makeover, from the users to the infrastructure to the technology involved to the people who are tasked with actually governing that as well, because that can't be an easy job, like you've just said as well.
Yeah.
Aside from the responsibility, what they have to do and manage and kind of make decisions on from a day-to-day perspective.
Yeah, because most of these organizations they're optimized around taking in data, consuming data. Like most, any majority of SaaS services that you use, they're built to consume data. They're built to pull data in, and they're not really designed to get data out the other way. So it's like like a super highway. It's built 12-lane super highways built into these companies, and then it's like some country road dirt track, return journey.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah,
I suppose the metaphor that we're trying to bring is we're trying to tarmac on that return route.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose it has so much to do with the commoditization of data that's happened over the last decade or two anyway. And so it made sense for companies and, kind of data structures to be designed like that, because it was all about ingesting as much as possible and then building products based on that, or based on that data, that information, in order to do that. So when it comes to commoditization, slight rabbit hole question, but I'm sort of very interested in the world of crypto at the moment, and kind of decentralization, blockchain, and so on. Do you think that there's ever some kind of interesting, just spitball, ever any sort of interesting union between the sort of the security, but also the commoditization of data rights and privacy, and what could potentially be stored and secure in a blockchain type structure? Do you think that is there any thinking at the moment around that?
Yeah, there's definitely a few initiatives and movements around building these, I suppose, individual controlled kind of silos, or based on blockchain or some other technology. And then the individual controls their data, and then a company would tap into that data and then use it, as per requested. And so definitely some very interesting projects and companies starting in this space. I think ultimately, storing, controlling data is difficult for most enterprises. And the idea that you could push some of those requirements or some of those responsibilities back out to the individual, I think it's a big ask. And I think it's always going to be the minority that will, let's say, see the benefits or want to take on that responsibility. And I think there's definitely a place for these kind of user-controlled data hubs, but that, definitely for the foreseeable future, personal data is predominantly going to reside within the enterprise, and that's where, if we're going to solve this problem, that's where we're going to solve the problem.
Within the infrastructure that created the issue first, I suppose.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so then looking at the sort of the future question, here it comes. The future of where that goes and what it might look like in, let's say, enterprises, do the right thing, and it's not just lip service, and they really do start to reform the structure and the habits and sort of the processes around how privacy rights are controlled, offering more sort of, I suppose, agency around how end users are allowed to control, remove, edit their own data, and so on. What does that future look like, and what does that ecosystem look like? How will it have been improved?
Yeah, so
in your eyes?
I think, let's say in this decade, I think the primary change will be an education one. So first, from education of the individuals around their data rights, and almost an expectation that they would have these data rights, an education of the enterprise that it makes sense that personal data rights and the ability to handle personal data requests makes sense from a commercial point of view. On the technology level, this idea that data engineers and the people who build these solutions, that in the same way as security requirements are built into any good software engineering's kind of playbook or consideration, then privacy requirements, will be a consideration, and the ability of any data source to handle personal data requests. And then I think, once that is all in play, then the idea of an individual withdrawing, consenting, porting their data from one enterprise or from one situation or setting to another will become, let's say, the norm or the standard. So let's say I want to use one service and I want to use it for 3 months, and then I decide that I'm going to transition to another service. Then I would use, data portability in a standard format, and I could transfer that data to a second service. But I think it will always reside within the enterprise. But these standardized formats for transferring data, I would expect, maybe with the help of governments through regulation, that these will become the norm.
I suppose there's also a learning curve that governments will need to undertake for themselves as well. Just when you said that, my mind immediately went back to a couple of YouTube clips I remember reading when Mark Zuckerberg was grilled at one of the Senate hearings, I think 2 or 3 years ago, on Facebook's data practices. I think it was maybe as a result of the Cambridge Analytica fallout, and the senators and whoever prepped them, there was just a whole lot of dumb questions. And you could see that there's a massive disparity between where the law is currently and who looks after it, and where the best of what government can put forward is right now versus the people who are actually operating these structures. There's still a disparity there. So I suppose what you're saying is that needs to come into more of an equilibrium in order for any actual change to not only be made, but to be enforced as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, there was some classic conversations in those Senate hearings. I remember.
Senator, we run ads. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely, but we even see that right now, that there's this education piece that's happening everywhere. So for instance, right now, when we talk to a company, we're talking to the data protection officer, and it's the data protection officer then kind of introduces us within the company. And the reason that the data protection officer has to do that is because they're probably the only one, often they're the only one who's actually thinking, about these data rights and personal data requests. And then they're, introducing us and doing an education piece. So
they've got to be the champion.
Yeah, exactly. But what we think will happen, or as this kind of education piece starts to pick up speed, then in 4 or 5 years' time, it'll actually be the data engineer who will be coming out and saying, you know what, we need to build this in from the very start. If we're going to be storing personal data, then we're going to be having requests from the owner of the data, the individual, to withdraw consent to delete their data, that they want to update their data. We're not there yet, but I think give it 4 years, 5 years, then these personal data requirements are going to be just part and parcel of any company or any piece of technology or service that's being built.
Oh, well, that sounds optimistic. I don't mean optimistic as in hopeful. I mean that sounds great. That sounds like a welcome change, and definitely a step in the right direction for enterprises who are open to it, who can have a glimpse of really what's going to be coming anyway. And they've got to jump on that roller coaster, right? Otherwise, they risk being left behind. And like you said in the beginning, market forces dictate everything, so, and that is where the customer's attention is directed right now over their own data. Just a final question I had. I'm interested in your views around the kind of the fingerprints, if you like, or the distinction, if there is one, between data and an individual's ability to control their data and privacy, and identity. Because we're kind of seeing, and this is in a way what's interesting about blockchain and some of the other technologies that have evolved over the last few years is that there's sort of a digital signature that can be traced, obviously online through multiple different sources, and obviously your data is the biggest component of that, and the information that is collected. Do you have any kind of concerns or maybe just views on whether there's a distinction between somebody's data, somebody's information that can be harnessed and collected, and their identity, and also B, where and when that might go wrong, and how we could avert some sort of potential bad situation?
So I think any data I would consider any data which is could be used to identify an individual, I would consider personal data. So even if it's derived data from, if I'm right in something like, let's say, your typing technique could have a fingerprint, or how you use your phone could have a fingerprint, right? Because if let's say you follow the same patterns, and there's some signals that you're emitting out through your use of some technology, and that, if that's usable to identify you in some form or another, whether it's some directly identifiable or it's identifiable by linking it with another source of data, then that should fall under the same personal data rights as your name, your social security number, or where you live. So I wouldn't draw the distinction.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Well, I mean, it's been really, really cool to talk to you and to pick your brain on not only what's happening right now with the sort of where the battle for privacy and data rights is being waged, but also where hopefully it'll be progressing to in the near future. So I really look forward to seeing where and how Query Layer leads the charge on that.
Thank you, Alex. Yeah, it was, and I'm very excited to follow the podcast. I love the format. I love the first episode, and hopefully I don't leave the side down. And I'm looking forward to following it in the future.